Rear Admiral John Gregory Crace, Royal Navy, Australian-born, was 55 years old and on the bridge of His Majesty's Australian ship, Australia, when the flag deck reported aircraft inbound from the north. This was expected. He had been at sea for 6 days, knowing the Japanese were coming. He had ordered repel aircraft stations. The crew was alert. The gunnery officers were ready. The Japanese aircraft came in low, and Crace's task force evaded every torpedo and shot down 5 of them. This was professional. This was what they trained for. The second wave of aircraft was American. Crace did not have a procedure for that. To understand what happened on the 7th of May 1942 in the Coral Sea, you have to understand the kind of man who was standing on that bridge. Crace was not a sentimental officer. He was born on a sheep station at Gungahlin in New South Wales in 1887, sent to school in England, and entered the Royal Navy as a cadet aboard His Majesty's ship Britannia at 15, 40 years in uniform. He had taken his first destroyer command in the Great War, when the world he was now defending had been a different color on the map. The Australian squadron had been his since 1939. He spoke quietly. He wrote quietly. He kept a diary. He did not raise his voice on the bridge, and his officers said that when he did raise it, the deck plates seemed to bend. He had been given the worst position in Admiral Fletcher's plan. Frank Jack Fletcher, in command of Task Force 17, had 2 American fleet carriers, the Yorktown and the Lexington, and the question that obsessed him through the first week of May was whether the Japanese carriers in the Coral Sea would come to him first, or whether the Japanese invasion convoy bound for Port Moresby would slip past him through the Jomard Passage while he was busy hunting the carriers. He could not be in 2 places at once. So at 6:45 on the morning of the 7th of May, he detached Crace and gave him an impossible task. Take the cruisers, take 3 destroyers, sail northwest towards New Guinea. Position yourself across the mouth of the Jomard Passage. If the Japanese invasion fleet tries to come through, stop it. Crace had no air cover. Hold on that line. A surface force of 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers, told to operate within easy range of Japanese land-based bombers from Rabaul, told to operate within easy range of Japanese carrier aircraft if those carriers came south, told to operate without a single fighter overhead, told to do this in clear weather in tropical seas where there was nowhere to hide. Crace took the order. He did not complain. He turned His Majesty's Australian ship Australia northwest, and the rest of his force followed. The American heavy cruiser Chicago, His Majesty's Australian ship Hobart, a light cruiser under Captain Harry Howden of the Royal Australian Navy, the American destroyers Perkins, Walkie and Farragut. His own flagship, HMAS Australia, was commanded by Captain Harold Farncombe, Royal Australian Navy. Farncombe was an Australian-born officer who had topped his class at the Royal Australian Naval College. He was 39 years old. He had a reputation for icy competence and for never raising his voice either. The 2 of them, Crace and Farncombe, were temperamentally identical. The bridge of Australia that morning was a quiet place. The morning was hot. The sea was a deep, mid-ocean blue, almost purple, with very little chop. The visibility was 30 miles or more. The ships steamed in formation, with the heavy cruisers in line ahead, and the destroyers screening to the flanks. Aboard Australia, the lookouts swept the sky in regular sectors. Below them, the 8-inch turrets were trained fore and aft, but the close-range anti-aircraft batteries were manned. The 4-inch high-angle guns, the pom-poms, the Bofors, the Oerlikons. Belts were on. Ready ammunition was at the guns. Damage control parties were closed up. Boilers were producing full steam. Crace stood on the wing of the compass platform, binoculars around his neck, and waited. He waited for hours. The signal traffic that morning was sparse and unhelpful. Fletcher's carriers were a long way to the east now, behind a weather front, and the radio circuits to MacArthur's headquarters in Brisbane were patchy. Crace did not know what was happening to the south. He did not know that Lexington and Yorktown had launched a massive strike against a Japanese force reported to the northwest. He did not know that the Japanese light carrier Shoho had been sunk just after 11 that morning. He did not know that the famous radio call, "Scratch One Flat Top," had been bounced across the Pacific and back. He knew only that his task force was alone on a flat blue sea, that the air over the Yomard Passage was empty, and that somewhere to the north, a Japanese reconnaissance seaplane had probably already seen him. He was right about that. A Japanese seaplane sighted Task Group 17.3 at 12:40 in the afternoon, and a second seaplane from Rabaul confirmed the sighting at 1:15. The Japanese had then done what the Japanese always did at Rabaul in 1942, when they sighted Allied warships in their waters. They sent everything. At Rabaul, the 25th Air Flotilla, under Rear Admiral Sadayoshi Yamada, launched two formations. The first was 12 Mitsubishi G4M torpedo bombers, known to Allied crews as Bettys, drawn from the 4th Kokutai. The second was 19 Mitsubishi G3M level bombers, known to Allied crews as Nels, drawn from the Genzan Kokutai. The Nels were carrying two 250-kilogram bombs each, originally intended for Port Moresby. The Bettys had been switched at the last minute from a bombing load to torpedoes. The pilots had not trained extensively on torpedo work. Several of them had never dropped a live torpedo from a Betty against a moving warship. They had been given Crace's position, told it was an Allied surface force, and told to sink it. They came in low. At 2:30, the lookouts on Australia called aircraft from the north. Crace's gunnery officers had the bearings within seconds. The turrets that needed to swing did so. The pom-poms went to local control. The 4-inch high-angle guns went to barrage fire on the bearing. The bridge clock read 14:31 when the first Betty appeared at low level under the cloud base. Farncombe's voice came over the engine room telegraph. Hard a starboard, the wheel spun. His Majesty's Australian ship Australia, 10,000 tons of county-class cruiser, leaned in the turn. The Bettys came across her bow at less than 100 feet, dropped and pulled up. The torpedoes hit the water and ran. Crace watched them. Farncombe watched them. The torpedoes ran past Australia on both sides. None of them hit. He knew his ship. Crace would write later in his report that the seamanship displayed by Farncombe during the torpedo attack was of the highest order. He meant it as the highest praise an admiral can give a captain, and it was true. Farncombe had judged the lead, the speed, the moment to commit the turn. He had read the drop angles. He had not panicked. The other ships in the formation had executed similar evasions on their own initiative. The torpedoes ran and ran and ran, and not one of them hit. The Bettys took their losses. Crace's gunners shot down at least 4 of them during the run-in, and another after the drop. The formation leader, Lieutenant Kuniharu Kobayashi, was killed when his aircraft went down in the sea. One Betty crash-landed at Lae with serious damage. Another ditched in the water at Boyne, with a dead crewman in the back. The crews that survived to return to Rabaul reported that they had attacked a force of 1 battleship and 2 cruisers, and that they had probably damaged the battleship. His Majesty's Australian ship Australia was an 8-inch cruiser, not a battleship. The Japanese pilots did not know this. The Japanese pilots, brave, well-trained, professional men who had pressed an attack against heavy anti-aircraft fire at point-blank altitude and taken severe casualties for the privilege, had still made the same identification error the Americans would make 20 minutes later. They had looked down from the cockpit at a long grey cruiser with a high bridge structure and decided it was a battleship. The Japanese Navy in 1942 was the most professional carrier-trained naval air arm in the world. They had still got it wrong, but the Japanese had been precise. The Japanese had pressed their attack at the right altitude with the right weapons against the right ships. They had simply been beaten by good ship handling. That was a fair fight, fairly lost. Crace would write of the Japanese attack with professional respect. He would never describe the Japanese as disgraceful. That word was waiting for someone else. There was a lull of about 10 minutes. The bridge of Australia in those 10 minutes was a quiet place. The gunners reloaded. The damage control parties checked seams. The hoses ran. There was salt spray on the windows of the compass platform from the torpedo runs, and a junior officer mopped at it with a rag. Somewhere below, a stoker had been injured by a sliding tray of ready 4-inch ammunition. The medical party took him below. Otherwise, Australia was as she had been at 1429. Crace lifted his binoculars again. The second Japanese formation came in at altitude. 19 Mitsubishi G3M Nels of the Genzan Kokutai, 18,000 feet above the sea, line astern, in a long, unhurried run from the northeast. They were carrying their bombs in pairs. They were beyond the effective range of the 4-inch guns, and far beyond the range of the close-in weapons. Crace ordered evasive action, and the formation began to maneuver, the ships turning sharply at irregular intervals, trying to put themselves on a different patch of water than the one the bomb aimers had picked. Australia was again the focus. She was the largest ship in the formation, the most obvious target from 18,000 feet, and the Genzan crews had also identified her as a battleship. A pattern of bombs walked towards her across the sea. Tall white columns of water went up around her, lifting and falling. The crew on the upper decks were soaked. Bomb splinters rattled against the side. There was a hole the size of a fist through one of the searchlights, and a few minor cuts among the lookouts. The Chicago, off Australia's quarter, had a bomb burst close to her hull, and 2 of her crew were killed by shrapnel. 5 more were wounded. That was the closest the Japanese came. The Nels turned away to the north, and the Bridge of Australia counted heads, counted hits, counted misses, and reported to Crace that the ship was intact and combat-capable. Crace nodded. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said very dryly that he hoped the Americans had been watching, because that was how high-altitude bombing was supposed to look. He meant it as a joke about the Japanese. He would regret the joke within an hour. A signalman called aircraft to the south. Read that line again. The Japanese were to the north. The Japanese had withdrawn to the north. The Japanese bases were to the north. There were no Japanese airfields to the south of Crace's position. The whole of Australia and the whole of the Allied air effort in the Southwest Pacific area was to the south. These were friends. 3 twin-engined aircraft appeared at medium altitude, came over the formation in line abreast, and dropped bombs. The bridge crew of Australia did not at first realize what they were seeing. The aircraft did not look like Japanese aircraft. They were larger. The wings were wrong. The engines were wrong. But they were dropping bombs, and the bombs were coming down in patterns, and the patterns were straddling the formation. 1 stick of bombs fell close to the destroyer Perkins. Another straddled Australia. A third fell wide. Then they pulled up and turned for home. The home they were turning for was Townsville. The aircraft, in the version Crace recorded in his report and signaled to Fletcher within the hour, were identified initially as B-26 Marauders of the United States Army Air Forces. In other accounts, they were 3 B-17 Flying Fortresses operating at medium altitude. The sources have argued about the aircraft type for 80 years. What is not in dispute is that they were American, that they had come from Australia, that they had been on a bombing mission and were on their way back, and that they had identified Crace's task force as enemy and had attacked it. This was the 3rd attack of the afternoon. The Japanese pilots had been accurate. The Japanese pilots had been competent. The Japanese pilots had come within feet of His Majesty's Australian ship Australia. The Americans missed by 100 meters and went home. Crace's signal to Fletcher and to the Commander-in-Chief, Southwest Pacific, contained a phrase that was now starting to appear in his private vocabulary. The bombing, he said, was disgraceful. He said it once. He would say it twice more. The Bridge of Australia after the 3rd attack was not quiet. It was, briefly, loud. There were words on the bridge that an admiral does not normally hear from a flag captain, and there were words that an admiral does not normally use himself. And Crace allowed both. Farncombe is reported to have said that if he met those pilots in a hotel bar in Brisbane, in 3 months' time he would kill them with his hands. Crace is reported to have laughed. It is the only time anyone on the bridge that day reported the admiral laughing. It was a short laugh, and it ended quickly. The 4th attack arrived, 20 minutes later. This was the famous one. This was the one the historians would still be arguing about in 2026. 3 or more B-17 Flying Fortresses of the 435th Bomb Squadron, 19th Bomb Group, United States Army Air Forces, operating out of Townsville, came in at altitude over Crace's formation. Various sources put them at 18,000 feet. Other sources put them at 25,000 feet. The squadron history says 19 aircraft were airborne that day, returning from a bombing run against Japanese forces in New Guinea. Some of them, on the way home, saw warships beneath them identified those warships as Japanese, and dropped bombs. The aircraft was the B-17E. The bomb aimer was using the Norden bomb sight. The Norden was supposed to be the most accurate bomb sight in the world. The crews were briefed by the squadron intelligence officer at Townsville before takeoff, and the briefing they had been given, by every account that came out afterwards, was that any warship sighted north of a particular latitude in the Coral Sea was to be considered enemy. Crace's task force was north of that latitude. You see the problem. The bomb aimers in those B-17s, looking down through the bomb sight at the long grey cruiser with the high bridge structure, were following their briefing. They had been told a friendly task force would not be in those waters. They saw a task force. The task force must be enemy. Drop. The bombs fell. They fell around His Majesty's Australian ship Australia again, and they fell around the destroyer Perkins, and they fell into empty water either side of the formation. The crew on the upper decks of Australia, who had been bombed by Japanese aircraft 30 minutes earlier and were already wet and shaken and angry, were now bombed again by their own side. The pom-pom crews trained their weapons up at the silhouettes overhead, and the officer in charge had to physically order them not to open fire. The B-17s were too high to engage anyway. The 4-inch guns could have reached them. The order from the bridge was clear: do not engage. That order is one of the unsung disciplines of the Royal Navy. A pom-pom crew on Australia, in the temper they were in, would have been entitled in their own minds to shoot. Crace's officers did not let them. The reasoning was that even if the Americans had bombed them, even if the Americans had attacked them twice in 20 minutes, the Americans were allies, and allies do not shoot down Allied bombers, no matter what the provocation is. That decision saved lives in B-17s that the bombardiers of those B-17s would never know about. The crews flew home to Townsville and landed and were debriefed by intelligence officers who were taking notes. The notes the intelligence officers took were extraordinary. The B-17 crews, by the time they were on the ground at Townsville, were sure they had attacked a Japanese task force. They were sure they had hit it. The reports filed at Townsville that evening described attacks on Japanese cruisers and destroyers. The reports described observed hits. The reports described observed damage. They went up the chain through Brigadier General Royce, the local USAAF commander, to General George Brett in Brisbane, and from Brett's office to General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters. The radio chatter of the bombing run, picked up partly in transit and partly reconstructed afterwards from the crews, contained the phrases the Americans would use in their own war diaries that night. Damage observed on enemy cruiser, hits on enemy destroyer. The phrases are still on file. They are still readable in the archives. His Majesty's Australian ship Australia was not even hit. His Majesty's Australian ship Australia, on the same evening, hours after this attack, was steaming southeast at 15 knots, with no damage to her hull, no casualties beyond cuts and bruises, no impairment of any major system, and a flag deck full of furious officers writing signals. Stop and think about that for a moment. The Japanese, who had attacked Crace with 31 aircraft and trained crews and torpedoes and bombs, had reported they had sunk a battleship and damaged another. The Americans, who had attacked Crace twice by mistake with their own bombers, had reported they had damaged a Japanese cruiser and possibly sunk a destroyer. Two different air forces from two different nations on opposite sides of the war had attacked the same ships and reported the same false victory. The ships in question had not been touched. What had been touched was Crace's temper. He wrote his report that evening, in the Admiral's day cabin aft, by the light of a green-shaded reading lamp. The cabin had ridden out the same attacks the rest of the ship had ridden out, and the cabinet doors had popped open and a framed photograph of his wife had fallen forward on the desk and been straightened. Crace dictated. The flag lieutenant wrote. The wording went through 3 drafts. The final wording was as follows. The bombing of His Majesty's Australian ship Australia by United States Army Air Force's aircraft, in comparison with that of the Japanese formation a few minutes earlier, was disgraceful. Disgraceful, he said it twice now. He would say it a third time. The signal went off to Fletcher and to MacArthur's headquarters at Brisbane that evening. The signal also went off to the Admiralty in London and to the Australian Naval Board. Crace had been careful to copy widely. He did not want this incident to disappear. He had a sense by the time he wrote the signal of what was likely to be tried at Brisbane. And he was right. Brisbane denied the attack. General George H. Brett, MacArthur's air commander in Brisbane, the man responsible for every B-17 in the Southwest Pacific area, the man whose 435th Bomb Squadron had launched those aircraft from Townsville that morning, denied flatly that any of his B-17s had attacked Crace. He prohibited further discussion of the incident within his command. There would be no internal inquiry. There would be no acknowledgement. The attack had not happened. It did not happen. That is what they said in Brisbane. The bombing of an Allied admiral's flagship by the Air Force of an Allied nation, observed by every officer on the bridge of the flagship and by every officer on every other ship in the formation, witnessed by Australian and American sailors who counted the bombs as they came down, had not happened. Crace read the denial. He kept writing. He sent another signal. This signal repeated his earlier observations and included a detailed listing of the aircraft sighted, the altitude, the heading, the bomb pattern, and the time of attack. He copied the Admiralty again. The Admiralty in London had no patience for Southwest Pacific politics. The Admiralty in London read Crace's signal and asked MacArthur's headquarters in writing what had occurred. London made it clear that London expected an answer. The denial began to fail. It did not fail at once. It failed slowly, the way these things tended to fail when MacArthur's headquarters was involved. There were memoranda. There were meetings. There were polite letters between staff officers. There was a delicate suggestion eventually that perhaps an additional ship identification training program might benefit the bomber crews of the Southwest Pacific. That suggestion was eventually adopted. The 435th Bomb Squadron and the broader 19th Bomb Group received briefings on Allied warship recognition. The briefings included silhouettes. The silhouettes included His Majesty's Australian ship Australia. The acknowledgement of the incident itself remained partial. Crace was not surprised. He had been a serving naval officer for 40 years. He knew how friendly fire incidents were handled in the period between the World Wars and how they were handled in the early months of a new war when the institutions were still finding their feet. He had no illusions. He did not expect anyone to be punished. He did not, in fact, want anyone to be punished. He wanted the briefing to change. He wanted his crews to be safe from their own side. He wanted the next surface force that was detached to operate in waters reachable by Allied bombers, not to be bombed by those bombers. That was a reasonable thing to want, and he eventually got most of it. But he did not forget the day. A few weeks later, he sat down at the desk in his cabin and wrote a private letter. The letter was to a fellow officer in the Royal Navy whose name does not need to be remembered because the letter survives in the official files and the phrase that survives in it is the one that matters. The phrase is the one we have been listening for since the first attack. Their bombing, Crace wrote of the Americans, in comparison with that of the Japanese formation a few minutes earlier, was disgraceful. He said it a third time. Disgraceful. The bridge of Australia, on the evening of the 7th of May 1942, after the last attack had passed and the formation had reformed and was steaming southeast, was quiet again. The sea was darkening. The horizon was deep blue. The lookouts continued to scan the sky in regular sectors, but the sky was empty now and would remain empty until the morning. Crace stood on the wing of the compass platform and lifted his binoculars and put them down again, and lifted them and put them down. Farncombe stood beside him, and the two of them did not speak for some minutes. Eventually, Farncombe said something to the effect that the worst thing about the day was not the Japanese. Crace said that he agreed. Farncombe said something to the effect that the worst thing was that the Americans had been so sure. Crace said that he agreed with that also. They did not say anything else for a while. A signal was brought to the bridge. Crace read it. The signal was from Fletcher and confirmed that the Japanese carrier Shoho had been sunk and that the main Japanese invasion convoy bound for Port Moresby had turned back. Crace's task force was no longer required to block the Jomard Passage. The Japanese were no longer trying to come through. The invasion of Port Moresby would not happen, at least not by sea, at least not this month. Crace had completed his mission. He had not fired a torpedo. He had not engaged an enemy surface ship. He had simply existed in the right patch of water with 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers, for long enough that the Japanese decided not to risk their invasion convoy against him. That was, in the way naval professionals understood it, the highest form of success. A fleet in being, a force whose mere presence had altered the calculus of the enemy. He turned for the south. The task force came back to harbor over the next several days. The casualties were minor. The wounded from Chicago were treated. The dead from Chicago were buried at sea with full honors. The bridge of Australia, scrubbed clean of salt and broken glass, returned to its normal hum. The pom-pom crews stood down. The damage control parties stood down. The ready ammunition was returned to the magazines. The ship that had been bombed 4 times in one afternoon by 2 different air forces resumed her routine, and her crew slept for the first time in days. There was an investigation. There was, more accurately, a series of investigations. Each of them was conducted at a different level. Each of them reached a different conclusion. None of them was published in full at the time. The American official history of the war, written years later by Samuel Eliot Morison, would describe the incident accurately, including Crace's quotation of the word disgraceful in his report. The Australian official history would also describe the incident accurately. The British official records would record the incident with their usual dryness. MacArthur's own official communiques, issued at the time, would never quite acknowledge it. That, too, was no surprise. MacArthur's headquarters in Brisbane in the spring of 1942 was a place where certain truths were sometimes adjusted before they reached the press. Crace had no influence on that. He was a foreign admiral in command of a squadron that included American ships, and his opinions of MacArthur's air arm were not, as the diplomats say, congenial to the local command. He let it go. He let it go in his official correspondence. He did not let it go in his private papers. His private papers, after he died at Hampshire in 1968 at the age of 81, were eventually deposited in the archives and became available to historians. The historians, when they came to write the account of the 7th of May 1942, found the word in his letters and his diaries and his notes. They found it in the report he had filed that night. They found it in the signal he had sent at the time. They found it in the supplementary signal he had sent the next morning. They found it in his correspondence with his fellow officers over the following weeks. The word survived him. Disgraceful. The investigation into the 435th Bomb Squadron's bombing, when it was finally conducted, found that the squadron intelligence officer at Townsville had briefed the crews along the lines that the style of the day had encouraged. Air crew were told to assume that any warship sighted in the area north of a certain latitude was enemy. The intention behind that briefing was reasonable enough. The waters north of that latitude were, in 1942, full of Japanese warships. The aircrew were young, fatigued, often flying in poor weather and poor visibility, and the safest assumption from their point of view was that anyone shooting back at them was Japanese. It was a briefing that erred on the side of attack. It erred too far. Crace's task force, by Fletcher's orders, had been sent north of that latitude precisely because the Japanese were attempting to come through it. That was where the action was. That was where any Allied surface force operating against a Japanese invasion convoy would inevitably be. The briefing had not contemplated that situation. The briefing had assumed the waters were a one-sided shooting gallery. They were not. The briefing was changed. The crews were briefed differently after the 7th of May. The new briefing included the silhouettes of every Allied warship operating in the Southwest Pacific area. The new briefing emphasized that the absence of a positive identification was not, in itself, evidence that a ship was enemy. The new briefing made clear that uncertainty was to be resolved by withholding the attack until certainty was achieved. The new briefing, in other words, did what the old briefing had failed to do, which was to assume that Allied surface forces would operate in dangerous waters. That was the legacy of Crace's report. It was not a glamorous legacy. There were no medals struck for it. There was no headline in the newspapers. The Australian and American press at the time covered the Battle of the Coral Sea as a major Allied victory, which it broadly was. And the press did not dig into the question of whether the Allied admiral commanding the surface support group had been bombed twice by his own side. That was not a story the press in May 1942 was going to publish. It was, however, a story that mattered. It mattered because, In the months that followed, Allied surface forces in the Southwest Pacific area were not bombed by their own bombers, or were bombed less often. It mattered because crews like the ones at Townsville learned to recognize Australian ships. It mattered because, at the operational level, the friendly fire problem was understood and addressed. It mattered because Crace had written it down and refused to let it disappear. The Japanese, for their part, also went on believing for some time that they had sunk an Allied battleship. The damage reports from the 25th Air Flotilla on the evening of the 7th of May claimed one battleship of the Warspite class sunk and one cruiser badly damaged. The Japanese pilots who had pressed home their attacks at close range and lost so many of their own number had not seen the bombs miss. They had seen the splashes alongside the ships. They had seen the smoke from anti-aircraft fire. They had seen the maneuvering, and they had drawn the obvious conclusion, which was that they had hit. They had not hit. So you had the strange position that by the evening of the 7th of May, the Japanese believed they had sunk an Allied battleship that did not exist, and the Americans believed they had sunk a Japanese cruiser that did not exist, and Crace's task force had taken no hits at all. 3 claims, 3 sets of victors, 1 reality. The reality was on the bridge of HMAS Australia. The reality was that Farncombe had handled his ship well. The reality was that the gunners had handled their weapons well. The reality was that the formation had executed its evasions well. The reality was that an Allied surface force of 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers, operating without air cover within range of Japanese land-based bombers, and within range of Japanese carrier aircraft, and within range of friendly bombers that mistook them for the enemy, had survived an afternoon of continuous air attack and had completed its mission and had turned for home undamaged. That was the reality. The reality did not survive into the propaganda of the next few weeks. The propaganda on both sides preferred the version with hits. Crace did not give interviews about the bombing. Crace did not write a book about the bombing. Crace was promoted out of command at sea later in 1942 and went to Chatham Dockyard, where he served as the dockyard superintendent for the remainder of the war. The appointment was honorable, but it was not a sea command. Some of his fellow officers thought he had been quietly punished for his outspoken criticism of the Americans. Other fellow officers thought he had simply reached the end of his sea time. Crace himself never recorded his own view of the appointment. He went to Chatham. He did his work. He retired in 1946 as a full admiral. He was knighted. He moved to Hampshire and lived there for the next 2 decades. He died in 1968. The bombing of his flagship by American B-17s passed quietly into the history books. The phrase passed with it. You will find the phrase, "if you go looking," in Samuel Eliot Morrison's volume on the Coral Sea, in Richard Hough's biography of the Royal Australian Navy, in the Second World War, in the official Australian war history, in the Australian War Memorial's online encyclopedia, in the archive of Crace's papers at the Imperial War Museum, in the operational records of His Majesty's Australian ship Australia, held in Canberra in the squadron diaries of the 435th Bomb Squadron at Maxwell Air Force Base. You will find the phrase in all these places. The phrase is always the same. Disgraceful. A short word. A clean word. A word that was used in those days in the Royal Navy with a particular force. It was not a word an admiral used lightly. It was not a word an admiral wrote into an official report without intending it to land hard. It was the word Crace chose. He chose it on the evening of the 7th of May. He chose it again in his report. He chose it a 3rd time in a private letter weeks later, with all the heat of the moment long gone, after he had had time to weigh his words and consider whether he wanted to soften them. He did not soften them. The image to hold in your mind at the end of this story is the image of the Admiral at his desk in the cabin aft on HMAS Australia, weeks after the battle. After the formation has come home and the ship has been refitted and the wounded from Chicago have been buried, after the press releases from Brisbane have been issued and forgotten, after the investigation has begun and slowed and stopped, after the new ship recognition briefings have been quietly introduced at Townsville and the bomber crews have been quietly taught the silhouettes of His Majesty's Australian ships, the image is the Admiral at his desk with a pen in his hand, writing a letter to a fellow officer. The letter is private. The letter is not for publication. The letter will not be released in his lifetime. The letter will sit in a file in his papers for the next quarter of a century. The pen moves. The pen reaches the word. The pen finishes the word. The pen lifts. Disgraceful. The office is silent. A lamp burns on. The ship hums faintly in her berth. The 7th of May is months behind him now, and the rest of his war is ahead of him, and the years between him and Hampshire and his quiet retirement are still uncounted. He folds the letter. He addresses it. He puts it aside for the morning's mail. He turns out the lamp. The bridge of His Majesty's Australian ship Australia, on a hot afternoon in early May 1942, had been attacked 4 times in 3 hours. By 3 different forces, by 2 different nations, and not one of those forces had hit her. That was the truth of the 7th of May. That was the truth Crace put in his report. That was the truth the historians eventually wrote down. And that, more than the headline victory at the Coral Sea, more than the sinking of the Shoho, more than the famous radio call of Scratch 1 Flat Top, is the truth that has been quietly preserved in the archives of 3 navies and 1 bomber squadron for the better part of a century. A cruiser, undamaged. A captain who had handled his ship beautifully. An admiral who had refused to let the incident be buried. And 1 word written 3 times. Disgraceful.